Hi.
You know Sonic the Hedgehog?
Today I want to talk about the new Scott Pilgrim animated series on Netflix, because Scott Pilgrim is one of my favorite movies ever, but even this didn't make me terribly excited for the Netflix adaptation at first, because I've already seen it so many times. But this series is so much more different than I could have imagined, and expands on so many parts of the Scott Pilgrim universe, and yet, at its core, the Scott Pilgrim we all love is still there, even though he, takes off. I mean, they did literally tell us he takes off. This video will break down why people are upset about the series, what I like and dislike about it, and a lot of interesting differences and overlaps between the comics, movie, games, and the animated series. So let's get started. Obviously there will be spoilers for Scott Pilgrim, so, you know, I guess you can go if you want, but I'll be sad. The best place to begin is to address what happens for Scott Pilgrim's animated series to be so different than the books and movie. While the books and movie are about Scott Pilgrim fighting for the manic pixie dream girl Ramona Flowers against her 7 evil exes, the show creates a scenario in which Scott loses the first battle to Matthew Patel, being reduced to pocket change. I think it's such an interesting twist, because the majority of the show revolves around Ramona confronting her exes as opposed to Scott doing so. I think that's a really interesting avenue to explore, and there's a lot more depth given to a lot of the side characters as well as the exes. Like, not only do you get fights like Patel versus Gideon, but you get Scott's roommate Wallace and his own stunt doubles for a movie they're filming about Scott's life, fighting against Envy Adams and Ramona, who's her stunt double now. Like, that's such a crazy concept, and I love it so much. But most of all, the special explores Ramona coming to terms with her past and her exes, what they were like when they were together a little more, and why it didn't work out. It even goes to show the exes living their new lives after the events of the show, and it gives so much great characterization for the League of Evil Exes. The series isn't necessarily a sequel or prequel, but more like an alternate universe, which is where part of this controversy comes in. I think a lot of people just wanted an animated version of the movie, and while some would ask why you'd want an animated recreation of something that already exists, some people insisted they just like the medium of animation and would like to have seen one of their favorite comics in motion, in drawn motion. I think every rendition of Scott Pilgrim adds and takes away elements, which is really cool. Like, apparently a lot of people were upset Scott's friend Lisa wasn't in the live action movie, but there's so many little characters and moments that couldn't be squeezed into the original live action movie that we see here. One of the most subtle ones you may have missed is Ramona's cat, Gideon. Yes, her cat is also named Gideon, like her ex-boyfriend, Gideon. People really appreciate Cat Gideon as a nice symbol in the later books, but seeing him here in the animated show is a nice little reference, and I feel there's a lot of interesting things like this in the animated series that's more directly from the books that was never captured in the movie. The other character I want to quickly mention that's in the show that didn't make an appearance in the movie is Mobile, Wallace's boyfriend. Is it Mobile or Mobile? They don't even name drop him, so it again feels like something that stands fine on its own, but it feels like it's there for the fans of the book and series as a whole too. So when people feel that this special betrayed their expectations or trust, we can at least acknowledge it's made from a perspective of knowledge and love. Also, we meet future Wallace and Scott, and it turns out Wallace lives in a lofty mansion because his man works for Nintendo, which drives Scott crazy. And I guess it's implied Mobile works for Nintendo, so if this is true, it's just another little lore drop or what if that's really crazy for the hardcore fans of the series.
All right. I didn't want to do this so soon, but he's right. Somebody needs to tell you. Wallace's husband works at Nintendo.
Where they make the video games?
Yes.
Especially because half the joke surrounding Mobile in the original books was that he was never on screen, and when he was, Scott thought he was Gideon. Going back to Scott turning in the coins, Scott Pilgrim has always been a very gamer reference heavy franchise, and turning in the coins is a reference to classic beat 'em up games, and a nice little touch the show has from time to time is showing the coin balance go up on characters. Like when Matthew Patel fires the director and the director explodes out of shock, you actually see the coin balance on Patel go up, which is such a fun touch. Speaking of enemies turning into coins, Scott Pilgrim does have its own beat 'em up games that reference this, but the original beat 'em up I associate with turning into coins is River City Ransom. There's probably a game that came out beforehand with this mechanic, but I always think of the Mega 64 bit where they'd reenact River City Ransom, getting whacked and dropping like 1,000 coins on the ground.
Well, you defeated me before. Not this time.
What's that? What are you doing?
Oh, barf! Oh!
Oh my god.
This is like my favorite Mega 64-bit ever. Now I should mention, I think this is one of the most gorgeous animated shows I've ever seen. Scott Pilgrim has always been one of the most prominent examples of Western comics / cartoons meets anime, and has such a huge influence on artists and webcomics. So when you get a series animated by Science Saru, led by one of my favorite animators / artists, Masaki Yuasa, who's probably most known for directing Mind Game, but in recent years has directed Ping Pong the Animation, Lou Over the Wall, and even Netflix's series of Devilman Crybaby. Science Saru combines elements of traditional animation with digital animation, noting key animation being first drawn by hand and then being redrawn in Adobe Animate. I love the anime style combined with the big round cartoony eyes, and they got a bit of a panty and stocking style proportions where their limbs extend out wider, and I love how they look when they close their eyes and just have these giant chunky closed eyes. The line work and textures just blow me away. They have this semi-rough yet super refined look which really helps push the combination of traditional and digital elements in Science Saru's work. And while this show is beautiful in its art style, when we look at the actual animation, it's even better. There's not a single shot in the whole show I can't say looks amazing. There's so much action and great choreography in the fights, and yet the animation is smooth, often with camera moves and lively motion, while the poses are really strong too. Lucas Lee fighting the paparazzi ninjas while on his skateboard combines so many cool action elements together, and I think this scene could be talked about for years to come. There's another cool visual effect they do here I haven't really seen before in much animation, where they really put stuff out of focus, yet they overlay or redraw the character slightly on top of themselves. Like, look how skewed the foreground is here. It's like every decision is made with a handcrafted element in mind. They could have just blurred the foreground, but layering the character in line work like this is just so interesting to me. I personally really enjoyed the voice acting. The English dub, do you still call it a dub if it's the original? The English voice acting for this anime, wait, is this an anime or a cartoon? Because it's animated by a Japanese studio, but it's based off a Western comic. Anyways, the cast from the live action movie does the voice acting here. Not everyone is happy with this, which initially surprised me quite a bit, since I think they did a great job. But one of the main critiques I've read is that the voice acting felt a bit flat, or the characters weren't very expressive, or didn't really match what they were saying with the over-the-top animation, but I'd have to disagree. I thought that the characters were expressive and the voice cast did a great job, and this series was created with the original English cast in mind, so it's not really like a dub over, you know? I almost think people might be thrown off by the distinct expressions of the characters as not really emoting too much, but I think it looks fine, and if anything, they sometimes give off expressions like it's the comics, but animated. Like, check out this clip. Do you think Steven isn't very expressive here, or do you think that's just the style of the show?
Wow, you might be the best band of all time.
We're not.
Maybe Knives has really good taste, and knows things others don't.
Wouldn't count on it.
Want to do it again?
Let's do it again!
I've read a lot of comments that say the voice acting doesn't match the over-the-top Japanese animation, so there's definitely a mixed opinion on this. So while I personally like the voice acting, another point I didn't even think about was the music. Anna Managuchi, who you're hearing now, did the amazing OST for the games and is back here, but a lot of people felt the show was just a bit too quiet or disconnected. And honestly, I don't remember hearing much music in the show. I wouldn't even say it wasn't memorable as much as I fear it may have just not existed. But if anyone feels differently, I'd love to hear from you. To summarize Scott Pilgrim Takes Off's intents and themes, it explores Ramona's past, reflecting and giving more insight on her exes. Scott learns from his future mistakes by confronting his future self, and the evil exes are liberated from their obsession and hatred and go on to live reasonable lives, like Lucas Lee becoming a barista, for example. Similar to the other Scott Pilgrim stories, Scott always has to fight himself both symbolically and literally, like fighting Nega Scott in the comics and movies, so this is a really interesting twist to not fight his worst qualities in the form of some doppelganger, but rather his future self if he keeps running away from and forgetting his mistakes. It hits a lot harder while still maintaining a story archetype of confronting your reflection, consistent in the Scott Pilgrim series. It turns out old Scott is the main antagonist here, because in the future, Scott and Ramona hit a rough patch, and Scott thinks it's easier to train 24/7 for 10 years straight, go back into the past, and fight his past self so he never falls in love with Ramona in the first first place, as opposed to, you know, fighting to repair the relationship in the present. And I think it does a great job of acknowledging that Scott and Ramona both run away from their problems, and they're both kind of a mess. Also, I love old Scott's design because it's badass yet hilarious because of his voice, and like, despite his absolutely yoked natty build, he still geeks out at the mention of Sonic the Hedgehog.
Super Ramona! It's just like Sonic the Hedgehog 3! I mean 3!
I just love it so much. One thing I really liked about the live-action movie was Scott learning to fight for himself, and his development revolves around earning the power of self-respect, which in turn allows him to help and love others instead of hurting them. Ramona takes a similar path in the animated series, confronting her past of running away from what she loves and avoiding getting hurt, while also talking with and fusing with her future self. Also, I don't think the sword is directly called the power of self-respect in the movie, but in the comics, Scott has a sword manifested from the power of love, and then gets a sword for the power of understanding, and I don't know if that feels a little too on the nose for some people, but I really like it. I think it's really cute and cool. So it's interesting to kind of see its carryover in the series. There's just a lot of cool elements and archetypes in each version of Scott Pilgrim that make it still feel like Scott Pilgrim no matter how much they change, like Scott and Ramona facing other versions of themselves. It's just such a nice touch. I think quite a few people believe this new series lacked a bit of depth, and that the short amount of episodes with a blistering pace doesn't allow too much room to breathe or develop, citing scenes like the beach scenes and dinner scenes from the comics, as opposed to the show revolving more around fights and jokes. So I looked up how a lot of people felt on social media about the new series, because I wanted to learn more about why people felt upset about the series. This isn't to call out any of the comments, whether I agree with them or not, so be respectful to these people and all that, and let's read a few of these. So this person got downvoted a lot for this comment, but it's important to note because there's a lot of people that agreed with them, and while I felt differently, I think it's important to note just how many people feel betrayed by this bait and switch with Scott. Spades44 says, I'm genuinely upset that they baited us in with the trailers in the first episode that made it look exactly like the comics, just to say, fuck you, here's an alternate universe where half the characters are boring now and the titular character is gone for 6 to 8 episodes. They also go on to say, it's lying because the story isn't Scott Pilgrim, it's Ramona Flowers. People have been begging for an animated adaptation of the comics since the Adult Swim promo dropped 13 years ago. All of the marketing in the entire first episode intentionally made people believe it was going to be a comic adaptation just to replace it with something that's lesser. The problem is that the bait was better than the switch. Ramona's story's alright, but compared to Scott's story, it's not even in the same universe. This user, Define Acceptance, says, you're getting downvoted, but you're not wrong. The marketing was willfully disingenuous in order to subvert expectations and limit any backlash it might have had before releasing. Maybe I'm just fortunate to have not really looked into it much before watching it, but I don't know if I could say this was disingenuous marketing to have this plot twist. Like when people say it was marketed like this to limit backlash, I don't know how much backlash the series would have had if it was called like Ramona Flowers Saving Scott Pilgrim or something like that. Another comment I see a lot is people saying this show includes references and context that only fans who have read the books would understand, which is a bit more hardcore than people who just saw the live action movie, which also happens to be on Netflix. I haven't read the books in well over 10 years before watching this series, and I still really enjoyed it and never felt lost. But yeah, I guess some people just feel it's a really weird position where hardcore fans feel betrayed it's not a direct adaptation, and other fans might feel lost or that it's a bad place to start Scott Pilgrim, effectively alienating a lot of people. This is why we get such mixed reviews despite the beautiful animation, really funny jokes, and including the movie cast to reprise their roles. Regarding the ending and plot twist, Kureitan says, I don't know if it's really negated. They said they still had a lot of happy years together. While Scott was on the right path when we last saw him, it was still clear he had a lot of work to do, and it makes sense they would still get in fights and have issues. The show still highlights they were meant to be together and just had a rough patch. I don't know, I'm still trying to process it. Personally, I feel like I would have liked knowing the premise going in rather than expecting a faithful adaptation, but I will admit the surprise definitely made me more invested. It's tough. I guess one thing I will say is about the movie and the series, it doesn't end on the hugest closure note of Scott and Ramona solving everything, but that's what I really like, you know, like the movie Scott doesn't get everything he wants, and it's good because, you know, he's not really a good person, or like, you know, he's just learning to become a good person, not everything good's gonna come at once. I think it provides really real circumstances and outcomes while still feeling rewarding enough with that development, but I can see why other people wouldn't feel too crazy about that. Before I go, Oh, some other fun little tidbits regarding differences, overlaps, and random references. One of the more obvious yet funny ones would be Ramona's job changing from delivering for Amazon to delivering DVDs for Netflix. As you may know, Netflix started as a DVD mailing service, so for a series to be adapted by Netflix referencing this is kind of a funny meta reference. Did you know the opening for the show references the anime and manga Beck, Mongolian Chop Squad? We see Sex Bob-omb singing in a manner really similar to the opening for Beck, in which the characters lip sync to the opening, and it's pretty similar how they have the band set up and bobbing their heads. Just a crazy reference to one of my favorite animes I'd never expect to see reference, and from Scott Pilgrim of all things. Beck's opening is one of the best anime openings ever, sung by one of my favorite bands, Beat Crusaders. Beat Crusaders also does the theme song to Kappa Mikey, a cartoon about an American actor in Japan, so I don't know, we're crossing a lot of wires here between orange-haired North Americans and their infatuation with Japan, and now Beat Crusaders is in both universes in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, if you want to know more about Kappa Mikey and Beat Crusaders, check out my interview with the creator of Kappa Mikey after this video. Moving on to a little more obvious fact, in the live action, Scott meets Ramona at the party and asks her if she knows about Pac-Man's original name being Puck-Man.
Because, not because Pac-Man looks like a hockey puck. Paku means flap your mouth, and that they were worried people would scratch out the P, turn it into an F, like.
Here, Scott asks Ramona if she knows about Sonic, and how the same guy voiced Sonic in a more silly Sonic cartoon and a darker, more serious Sonic at the same time. I think this is a great modernization, as a modern Scott would totally be a Sonic fanboy, but it's a funny meta reference for Scott to make a joke about voicing the same guy in two different instances. Kinda like how Michael Cera is voicing Scott in the animated series, as well as being Scott in the live-action movie. Lisa, a fan favorite from the comics, who wasn't in the live-action movie, can be seen in the background of the last episode of the series behind the Katyanagi twins. There's so many little references and fun things like this, but quickly going more into overlaps, I really enjoyed that the first episode felt very much like the start of the movie and comics. I love the party scene, and Scott asking Ramona about Sonic has been making the rounds the past few days. But an interesting subtle change is I feel Ramona acts a lot more amicably towards Scott in the animated series. Some people feel that Ramona going on this huge quest to find the missing Scott after just one date isn't too believable, but she's still a lot more open to Scott right away than she was in the movie, I feel. This is another one of those inevitable things due to production, but you know, you got 8 episodes and a lot to go through, so you don't really have the time to pace stuff out more and make it more believable or have more weight in some instances. Comparing some of the scenes, they feel so similar, but I just feel a lot better about them in the animated series in some weird way. Like in the movie, when Ramona has Scott over for the first time and they get into bed, Ramona says that she doesn't want to have sex with Scott. And while Scott doesn't mind this, in the series, Scott says that he's not ready for this. It's subtle and might not mean much as we get to the same outcome, but I think this little characterization moments do make me appreciate the relationship and what Ramona is potentially fighting for a lot more in the show. This is a change that can't be really compared as hard though, you know, since it's not Ramona fighting for Scott in the movie. There's other story elements that will only really be understood if you read the books, like how Todd cheats on Envy with Wallace of all people in the show, but it's funny to note Todd didn't cheat on Envy in the movie, but he actually does in the books, with the band's drummer, Lynette, who ironically is not in the movie or the animated show. I think this is another character besides Lisa a lot of people expected to return here. Like, one thing I totally forgot about Lynette is in the comics, she's the one who punches the highlights out of Knives' hair, whereas in the movie, it's Todd that does this.
I'm not afraid to hit a girl.
It definitely does a good job of making Todd look like more of a douche, so I guess it's a good change. Overall, I really enjoyed the Netflix special. I'd say it isn't a good way to start Scott Pilgrim, but if you're a fan of the books and movie, it expands upon what you love if you don't feel betrayed by the expectations of an animated version of the comics or movie. I'd love to know what you think of the animated series, because if you loved it or hated it, I always want to read why, and I always feel like I'm learning something new from y'all, which is my favorite part of making videos. I'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. You know, most of my viewers aren't subscribed, but seeing the number goes up makes my brain happy, so please do it. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you on Thanksgiving morning. We're talking about Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Thanksgiving special. That should be fun. Alright, bye.